Hi, it's John. Thanks for joining me today here on FinTech Plus. I'm very pleased to be joined by an old friend from London, although he's been all around the world. It's Nektarios Liolios. Hi, Nektarios. How you doing?
Hi, John. I'm all right, thank you. How are you?
And I forgot to mention you're doing something new and exciting in the last couple of years, the Future Farm. But why don't we get started with talking about a few of the things that we've done? Do you want to give everybody a quick personal introduction to yourself?
I'm Greek, born in Germany, lived in the UK for a long time. Um, I think what's relevant for your community is that my fintech and innovation journey started at the end of 2010, where I joined this crazy bunch of people at Swift called Innotribe. So because of that, I ended up leading the first global fintech competition called the Innotribe Startup Challenge. That led to me starting the first kind of collaborative fintech accelerator called Startup Bootcamp FinTech. Grew this to a large global organization. The company behind this is a company called Rainmaking Innovation. We did some exciting things working with banks and financial institutions and insurance companies and helping them to understand how they need to change and how they need to engage with startups. And at the end of 2018, I left it all behind and took a break. And I've been back with a couple of things we'll hopefully get the chance to talk about now.
I think that was a fabulous introduction. You covered it a lot more quickly than I tend to do with my fintech experience. And it was interesting when we were catching up before this to hear that you had also taken a big step back from fintech around 2018. We did it a bit differently, and we're back in a bit of a different way. But I think that's something that'll be really interesting to talk about. Before we do that, I don't want to make you dwell on it, but looking back, I think Innotribe was something that was really special, and not everybody was there with some of you that helped create it and know really what it went on to do in the years since. Can you just give a little bit of a quick version of what makes Innotribe such a special story?
So Innotribe was pioneering. It's as simple as that. And the interesting thing about it was a team within Swift. Swift is a member organization, so there was no commercial ambition to do this. So we were on a mission to educate the financial industry about all the changes that were happening, the new business models that were emerging based on new technologies that were made available. This is in the days before blockchain and Bitcoin and big data and AI and all the buzzwords we hear now. This was at the dates where we introduced or we amplified the term big data in 2012. Or we did have somebody from the Bitcoin Foundation on stage very early after Bitcoin was born. So it was all about education and engagement, but at a really kind of pioneering stage. So with the we had TransferWise when they just raised their first round. We had Revolut. We had some of the names that are unicorns. And we saw them very early on because we had the freedom and the budget to actually go out, explore, look at the new business models, look at all the, and go to the industry and say, guys, you need to know about this. You need to be part of this. You need to understand how to engage. And at that point, fintech wasn't a word. And there was nobody else who was doing anything similar.
I can attest. I was even a latecomer to it in around 2015, and I was really impressed already at the track record you guys had and the insights you had helped to explore. And it was just as the crypto world was starting to explode and fintech along with that. And that was around the time you were moving to Rainmaking, and I guess that was a much more commercial opportunity to try and harvest the returns. Or how would you describe the shift and what you were trying to do with the team at Rainmaker?
It was originally, that was not the intention. Because we saw these amazing startups within the Innotribe startup competition, we wanted to build an accelerator. This is at a time where there were no fintech accelerators. So accelerators weren't the big thing, especially in Europe. And we thought we need an industry accelerator. We need something that is collaborative and for the greater good. Let's build an Innotribe accelerator and let's find somebody who knows how to do this. So we started talking to Startup Bootcamp, which at that point was a relatively young organization, industry focused, without a particular ambition to go into verticals. And because of corporate politics, ultimately, most of the people in Innotribe left Swift and started doing some exciting stuff. And my old boss is now the deputy director of the Gates Foundation's Financial Service of the Poor. Matteo Rizzi, who everybody knows, ended up being one of the first corporate venture funds in fintech, and everybody else is doing amazing things. And for me, it was a logical thing to just leave Swift and start Startup Bootcamp FinTech as the first collaborative industry-focused program. And then we grew it over 5 years to nearly 10 locations around the world. The idea was to have always a group of players, a group of banks behind the program sponsoring, but also being available for the startups, because most of the startups that would come to us were B2B startups. So it was a dual value proposition. And Rainmaking, as the company behind it, was a commercial company. And of course, we had a variety of different engagements with the banks. We were sitting down at a very senior level with I don't know, a CEO of a bank and go, where's your innovation strategy taking you? What do you want to achieve? And what's your readiness? And how can we bridge the gap between the two? So that was part of the Rainmaking mission, and that evolved into a variety of really interesting and also quite visionary products over the years.
But I think you've experienced something that I've certainly experienced working at a bank and in the last 5 or so years advising banks and those around trying to make open innovation work. Actually facilitating effective open innovation isn't so straightforward, especially in financial services. And I think that's what you really experienced as well, especially with banks and insurers, right?
You're being much kinder than I am. I left at the end of 2018 because I was tired on multiple levels. There was a physical tiredness because I was traveling a lot. There was an element of burnout ultimately, but there was also this intellectual tiredness. I was just done. When you talk to more than 100 banks and you work with them quite closely, and you know the people, and you know that they know what is the right thing to do, but they don't have the guts to do the difficult stuff and only focus on the stuff that's easy to sell and easy to market. Then you just get a little bit worn and a little bit tired. And a lot of good people who came into this in the banking world at some point moved on because they got tired fighting against the machine. So I've been on stage so many times saying, look, these are the right things to do. We know these are the right things to do, but they're not easy. And we can go into the details of what they are, but it's things like incentivization of senior people. It's working around the shareholder expectations that don't incentivize, that don't reward innovation. They really focus on returns and all these other difficult things. We've been joking about procurement being one of the biggest obstacles for innovation in 2011. And guess what? In 2021, you still see articles of people writing about how important it is to sort out your procurement process if you want to do innovation. And you go, if you don't want to change it, let's not pretend. And I think for me, it came at a point where I was quite bleak. I was really no longer leaving people with an element of hope at the end of a speech, because I didn't really see that.
That's a really good way to sum it up. Not leaving people with hope at the end of your interactions. Positive energy and sharing that in our messages is something that's critical as leaders in the community, and feed off the community, but also feed the community, and that's an essential part of it. Something that I've believed for the last few years, I'd always heard it, but now I believe it, is really that business is war. And there were a lot of parallels drawn in the banking world with suits and coats of armor. But I think when you really look down at where mental health has been gaining better acceptance and being destigmatized, it first came from the traumas of war. But when you start to look at the experiences of a lot of people in entrepreneurship, and especially a more challenging area where you're dealing with systematic change like in financial services, it really can grind down individuals. That's really the center of a lot of your work coming out of 2019 in the last year, right? Do you want to talk more a bit about how that evolved for you and what you're doing?
Yeah. I ultimately came out of my time with two separate streams of thought. The one was being tired with everything, and this, I mean, ultimately I describe it as the noise. It's the noise that innovation people are making. It's the noise that the ecosystem that has grown around financial services innovation is also making, all the influences and the lists and the kind of the consultants who want to know, oh, what are the trends for next year? And you go, what do you care? You're not going to do anything about it anyway. So the noise was one thing that I wanted to move away from. But at the same time, having started with the ambition to be part of the change in financial services, I still had this curiosity about what to do on the FinTech side of things, but especially through Startup Bootcamp. So having worked with hundreds of early stage entrepreneurs and having worked with lots of people who were first-time founders, I saw many people struggling with their mental health, but not having any way to articulate what's going on and not having permission to acknowledge that they're struggling, because the accelerator was a pressure cooker. We were selling this as such, and it was this whole kind of Silicon Valley influenced mindset of, in order to succeed, you need to work yourself to death, and you need to kind of follow this cliche model that was portrayed by media and by VCs and by everybody else, and I thought I can't be part of the problem anymore. So founding the Future Farm was part of that experience, and looking back and going, so many people had a really, really difficult ride, and it wasn't for lack of alternatives. It's just that we didn't see the alternatives, so we didn't embrace a different way of doing things. And yeah, this is where I'm right now. On the one side, the Future Farm, which is a business focusing on helping entrepreneurs with their mental health, mental, emotional, psychological well-being. And on the other side, a venture builder that is still doing fintech, but with a slightly different remit.
Before we talk about the new venture builder and where that's going to focus, I wanted to say a few more words on mental health. I think not only is it a great opportunity for society and for entrepreneurs to better support that type of work, but I really do believe it's also a great fintech opportunity to help people better manage their career paths as we get into a more, let's say, gig economy or entrepreneurial economy, and yeah, lots of health services that aren't being well funded right now through other means. So probably a good spot for some fintech entrepreneur to worry about this year of great challenge and pressure.
It's funny. We started the whole kind of thinking around it, me and my co-founders, Vladi and Nadim, towards the middle of 2019. And then we launched, we did our kind of first proper work in the first couple of months of just about the time that we wanted to spread the word and the message about entrepreneurial mental well-being. COVID hit, and suddenly the conversation was more normalized. But a lot of people don't realize what it actually means to go through different types of mental health challenges. And it's really important to sort of put a little bit of context around this. So we're talking about this is not just, oh, I'm stressed or I'm anxious. It's more severe cases of depression. It's things like substance abuse, suicidal ideation, eating disorders. It's people going for days without sleep and using drugs to keep them awake and then needing drugs to get them to sleep. But it's also things like the adrenaline is so constant that even when you think you're relaxing, you're going for high adrenaline activity. So there's never a moment to wind down. And then people feel very lonely. People feel trapped, and I can go on for long. But the key thing is, in all of this, there is something around masculinity in this, because a lot of the founders that we dealt with, particularly in fintech, were male, which means you're not allowed to show vulnerability. You're not allowed to give yourself permission to say, hey, something isn't working and I need to address this. It's been seen as weak. It's still very stigmatized. And a lot of what we do at the Future Farm is just normalizing the conversation around this.
That's interesting. I think you're spot on about some of the ideas around masculinity and asking for help. I know myself, that's been something that's extremely difficult as a tall, sort of well-educated, otherwise, well-off sort of a fellow who likes to try and help others. It's tough to turn around and say, hey, I need some help, or what should I do here? And yeah. And it's incredible as well. We had a great discussion a month or so ago with Keith Campbell about the new science of narcissism. And it's funny, so much of this stuff that drives us to be successful, about having grandiose ideas or thinking we can battle with challenges, or, use certain substances, or even just, exercising too much, can become quite addictive and end up harming people. And yeah, it's a complicated topic that is great to be seeing more light. I'm glad you mentioned some of the topics that can come up. I don't want to spend too much time on mental health itself. Let's talk perhaps a bit about some more of the solutions. Something that I thought was an interesting thread from where you started with fintech and where you are now is the idea of tribalism. Do you want to say a few words about that in the context of venture building?
I actually, when I left my fintech life, I was seriously considering just leaving it all behind. But I had this kind of itch, if that's the right word, to still do something that hopefully benefits the greater good. And I started talking to a couple of friends of mine who were looking at all the communities around the world who are ultimately underserved by the financial system. They have specific needs, and ironically, or not surprisingly, the banks just don't care about the specific needs, because as a community, they're not lucrative enough, and therefore, yeah, as a generalist bank, you just offer a general service and everybody else has to just live with it. But for us, it was both of my co-founders, the original ideation, we were all gay. So we thought, as a gay person, as an LGBT person, we know that we have a very limited experience when it comes to financial services. And it could be, I don't know, being different in a credit profile, or finding it more difficult to get a loan, having to justify why you're applying for a mortgage with the same-sex partner, etc. And so all these things are happening, and there's real data behind this about the untapped potential on the one side, but also the experience that you go through as an LGBT person. So we decided, can we find a model where we start creating digital banks that understand the specific needs of the tribe, of this community, and built an offering around that. And we did that. And the first cap of the rank was a company called Daylight, which is live in operation in the US. It launched in November. And the CEO, Rob Curtis, and the great team around it are in the market to build an experience that comes from the community for the community, and it's a proper digital bank.
Any particular reason why you chose to do a digital bank as opposed to some other fintech opportunities? And it's interesting, why the US, the size of the market, something else?
Yeah, for the LGBT community, of course, it's the size of the market primarily, but it's also a relatively building a digital bank on top of the license of another bank with some of the core banking providers in the middle was much more achievable than doing it in some countries where there's no infrastructure. But it's size of the market, and it's the maturity of the community as well. You wouldn't try the same thing in Eastern Europe because people would struggle to even identify publicly as LGBT+. Why digital bank? Because it's a bit more fundamental, because our model is built on the premise that on one technology platform, you can build hundreds of iterations. We started talking not long after we had our first conversations around Daylight with Rob. We started talking to somebody who's building an African-American community, and they just recently raised their first round. They did this in the end on a different platform, but we realized that there's all these communities, being social, professional, affinity, geographical, that all feel that the generalist banks just don't serve them in the way that they need. We started talking to freelancers in Europe, SMEs. I'm Greek. I've still got this curiosity and this desire to do something in Greek. And you talk to hotel owners, small hotel owners, independent, who want an accounting system and a loyalty system plugged into that. So we're talking about the digital bank, but ultimately we're talking about a financial services experience that is targeted specifically to the needs of the community. And it could be lending focused, it could be investment focused, it could have different things. It's not about it being a bank. It's about being a platform that gives people what they need.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your journey to become a venture builder and an entrepreneur, because there was a day, I think just before we met, when you were a corporate executive and somebody who had a salary. Do you have any words of insight about your journey, about actually helping others build ventures, and especially in light of what we were saying, we're not going to share predictions and contribute to the fintech inertia. But for those who are out there and have an understanding of what needs to change and are a bit maybe on the other side of enlightenment from where you might stand, what can you share of the experience that you've been through over the last 10 years?
Wow, lots of things. First of all, 10 years ago, I was still corporate. It's very important. I still had a tie and a suit, but I had already moved into the Innotribe team, so I was allowed to drop the suit. But I was still being told off for wearing sneakers at Cybos because that wasn't the thing to do as a Swift employee. It has been a journey. I think if you take that as a one milestone at the beginning of my journey, and then you look at a conversation I had recently with my husband, that will give you an insight on what's happened since, where we both read the same article that was predicting that post-COVID, we're likely to get into this area of increased social activity, or people will be like the roaring 20s in the 20th century, be looking out for fun and entertainment and travel and debauchery. And my partner was saying, oh, we should invest in companies that kind of focus on that. And my brain was going, no, we should build these companies. So something's happened in the last 10 years where I have moved from an observer to an investor to a supporter to a builder. But the journey hasn't been easy. Absolutely not. And I've made all the mistakes in the book. It's kind of funny talking now to the entrepreneurs we deal with through the Future Farm. And I can relate to pretty much every single mistake that people make, because it's difficult to get through that without making the mistakes. And I also had my own mental health challenges because I was burnt out at the end, because I didn't look after myself. I didn't really use any tools that were available to give me some balance. The key thing is going into this prepared that it's not going to be easy, and being realistic about the fact that it may not succeed. And the problem is that a lot of people are being attracted by the glamour that is portrayed by media and the wider ecosystem, and really struggle at the first obstacle. And the other thing I've learned is asking for help. I should have done this earlier. It took me a long time to realize that I need some support. The interesting thing overall is that now in 2020, 2021, you see more people trying to find a different way to be an entrepreneur. It doesn't necessarily have to be the aggressive VC-backed 10x in 5 years, or all these other kind of things that come with being a kind of venture-backed startup. There's patient capital, there's people who are more inclusive, there's people who recognize that you may have a family and you still want to build a business. So there's a lot happening, but in my time, I wouldn't do anything different because I felt it was important for my personal journey. But at the same time, I made some mistakes.
Haven't we all? It's great to be able to be more transparent about that. We've talked about the idea of safe space for entrepreneurs, and I think especially in all the noise of fintech and the testosterone of finance and tech worlds, there isn't always that type of openness to be real. And I think that's where value is actually created. Where do you find, or actually the question I normally ask is, where do you find balance and inspiration? But when you're talking to other entrepreneurs and you're looking at some of those major mistakes, when it comes to the topic of wellness and mental well-being, what do you think are the kind of top 5 things or top 3 things that people need to keep an eye on?
I think it all starts, so we have a podcast. It's called Naked by the Future Farm. And the reason we have the podcast is because we want people who've been through it to very candidly, very openly share what they've experienced and focusing on different elements. So one of them is, when did you see the first signals that something wasn't right? How did these signals at some point become loud enough for you to realize you actually need to do something about it? Get people to describe how they hit rock bottom, and then get people to talk about the things that helped them come out of it. Because the idea behind this is that anybody who listens to the podcast will go, actually, I recognize some of these things. Maybe I should do something about it. There is no one size fits all, and there are not even the top 3 or top 5 things. The key thing is developing a discipline and a practice of introspection. Because everybody who has managed to deal with their own mental well-being at some point had to look inside and had to listen. And this is where a lot of entrepreneurs just don't dedicate time to this, because it's scary. And because they feel that by doing this, everything will fall apart. And reality is that if you kind of recognize that something isn't right and you start addressing this by talking to somebody or by finding a mechanism that will help you, you will actually have a much bigger chance to go through it, get through it without damage, without the business failing. So introspection is important, and this is where everybody's different. Some people like to meditate. I find it really difficult. I find all these mindfulness apps really, the silence is not for me, but I've discovered journaling as a way of every morning spending 15 minutes thinking about my day, my life, myself, and it centers me and it gets me going. And so it's important not to look for a set of kind of, hey, here's a pill. This is what's going to help you come out of it. And give yourself time to say, you know what, I need to dig a little bit, and it might be painful, but once we've done the digging, I might actually see some avenues that are suitable for me. And also not being afraid to try something. If it doesn't work, try something else. Signals, there's many. I mean, signals are anxiety. We're not sleeping well, not eating well, not looking after yourself. I didn't exercise at all when I was, and especially in the last 3 years of Startup Bootcamp. There's things around feeling isolated, feeling like you can't talk to somebody, feeling you've become unsocial. And then there's addictive behaviors that you can actually quite observe quite easily. And as you said, it doesn't necessarily mean substances. It could also be, hey, I run a marathon every weekend, because that can also be an addiction.
I think it's fantastic the way the world is really becoming much more transparent about all the different ways we can, help ourselves, but also perhaps burden ourselves when we look over the long term at how these things can become addictions and as negative as they are positive. Something I also found has been helpful over time to realize is it's a bit like when you're staring at one of these draw lines in a box problems, and the insight you have to make is that you can draw lines outside of the box to connect things sometimes. And I think when we look as entrepreneurs, so much of what we do is trying to solve things and take ownership for stuff. And the idea that we can get help and open up and help other people or invite other people to help us solve problems is something that's a major insight and a big advantage once people are able to do that. It's a lot more effective, I think, than some of the more readily available and often prescribed types of remedies for challenges in life. And it's a real life skill along with so many that you need as an entrepreneur as you develop. So glad to hear you're echoing that and helping people find the way. Can you mention, when's your podcast on?
Okay. I will mention the podcast. Thank you for giving me the chance. But on the point that you just made, it might be interesting to mention one thing. Because we are so many entrepreneurs across different stages and across different business types, so not just tech entrepreneurs, the one thing that became apparent was people really crave for peer conversations. So talking through stuff with somebody who's been through the same experience. So it's not about going to the therapist or going to somebody who's a coach, because they don't necessarily get the full kind of range of emotions you go through as somebody who builds a business and struggles. But talking to somebody who may not necessarily be in the same city, but understand the journey. So also not too competitive or not from the same ecosystem, so you don't not too exposed. So maybe just talking to somebody is a good start. Our podcast is on. We release an episode every Thursday, and we alternate. So we have a guest on, and the episode after, the week after, Vladi and I, my co-host, we sit down and we reflect on the episode, and we also look at what else is happening in the world and how does this relate to what our guest has discussed. And it's usually on a specific theme. So we pick a very diverse range of guests to cover the different ethnicities, geographies, business types, challenges. So in the new season, our first guest is somebody who built a business and then he stepped down as a CEO because he just wasn't happy as a CEO anymore. He didn't leave the business, he just didn't want to lead this anymore. And now he's in a very different place. The second one was about addiction. The current episode talks all about an artist who realized that in order to become to make a living out of art, she had to become an entrepreneur. There had to be business and art, and how is that kind of tension between the creativity and the commercial manifests itself in the same way that somebody who builds a startup in Silicon Valley on Shoreditch. So it's always about different aspects. But people do open up, and gee, some of these conversations get scarily vulnerable when people talk about the moments where they didn't want to wake up the next day, or they kind of considering kind of killing themselves. And yeah, but people get there, and more people than one would think. Yeah, so every Thursday on all platforms.
I know it's sometimes a heavy topic, but when you're doing big things, a lot of weight can be built up, and it's important to be able to deal with that effectively. And that's, I think, really what FinTech and the whole scene is all about when you come down to it. Getting through all the noise, it's about finding more effective solutions for these sorts of challenges in life. So great to hear the sort of stuff that you're working on, and I'm going to be following the podcast, and hope others will as well. Nektarios, I don't want to take up too much of your time and add stress, because this has been a lot of fun. But are there any other messages you think are important to leave with the audience here at FinTech Plus?
Wow, you didn't prep me for that. Look, for people who've been around for a while. And I think I can now comfortably say I've been around for long enough to remember the days pre-FinTech being a hashtag or a word. Some things are hard, and you just have to do them. And this is, for me, the message to the banks. And it hasn't changed. The problem is that in the absence of the banks doing it, I would just encourage more and more people to try and do it themselves without the banks. And if it means building a B2C business, then it's not easy, but it's worth it. We get so much joy out of all the new, smaller community banks we're building on top of the travel platform. So from that perspective, from a FinTech perspective, is trying to cut through the noise. We use the word noise, both of us, John, because there's so much noise still out there. The media is still producing all these lists. The influencers still talking about trends. And reality is the doers don't care about all this. They just kind of chug along and try to do the right thing and try to build a business that ultimately benefits an individual, a community, a small business, a large corporate. It doesn't matter. On the mental health side, it's take a moment to look inside and look at yourself and figure out if there's something that bothers you, worries you, and then talk to somebody. People are very friendly, and there's support mechanisms for every group of people, for every profile. Find somebody local you can talk to and see if you can find solace and comfort in just sharing, or if it's something bigger. The first conversation with a counselor or therapist is always scary, but it's not different from a first date. And then you develop a relationship where you have somebody who can actually help you kind of navigate the difficulties that there are?
It's a bit cliche, and it's probably a good thing. But for all the challenges that COVID has brought, and for some people, real challenges with addiction and mental health beyond the craziness of the fintech noise, it is actually a time when real opportunity does open itself up. So if there's anything I like to say to people these days, it's spring and the sun is coming out, and it's a great time to be doing stuff, finding solutions, and moving forward into the future. So, Nektarios, thank you so much for catching up with me today and sharing so much good news about what you've been up to. I look forward to hearing about all the good things that come from the future farm, because you're just getting planting in the early days now. And I hope you'll come back and join us in the future again.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All the best. Take care.